April 9th, 1945. Above the autobahn near Munich, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler watches in disbelief as formations of American fighters fill the morning sky. Not the sleek, nimble interceptors German pilots expect, but massive, ungainly machines that seem to defy every principle of aerial combat. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. 7 tons of American steel that Luftwaffe pilots have been mocking for 2 years as the Jug, short for juggernaut, a flying milk bottle too heavy and clumsy to pose any real threat. Stigler's squadron commander had briefed them just yesterday. These American fighters are defenseless at low altitude, easy prey for experienced Messerschmitt pilots who understand the art of dogfighting. The P-47's massive weight, over 13,000 pounds fully loaded, makes it sluggish in turns, vulnerable to the lighter German fighters that can outmaneuver them in any engagement. But Stigler notices something disturbing about the formation, approaching at 12,000 feet. There are dozens of them, perhaps 100 Thunderbolts in coordinated groups, each aircraft bristling with what appears to be an impossible number of guns protruding from their wings. The morning of April 9th will become known in Luftwaffe records as Black Tuesday, the day American fighters achieve something previously thought impossible in aerial warfare. 211 confirmed German aircraft destroyed in a single day of operations across the European theatre. The majority falling to those supposedly clumsy Thunderbolts, whose 850 caliber machine guns are about to teach the Luftwaffe that American engineering has solved the fighter problem through overwhelming firepower rather than European elegance. Stigler's radio crackles with warnings from ground controllers. Enemy fighters everywhere, rail lines under attack, airfields being strafed. The systematic destruction is already underway, and Franz Stigler is about to discover why. German pilots have stopped laughing at the flying milk bottle. The winter of 1943 found the 8th Air Force struggling with a fundamental problem that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators could reach targets deep inside the Reich, but they were being slaughtered by Luftwaffe interceptors that picked apart bomber formations with methodical precision. Fighter escorts using existing American designs, the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt in its early configuration, simply lacked the range to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Republic Aviation Corporation's solution had been controversial from its inception. Designer Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who understood that American industrial capacity allowed approaches impossible for resource-starved European nations, proposed building the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter ever conceived. The P-47 would be massive by any measure. Its Pratt & Whitney R-2-800 double-wasp engine alone weighed over 2,000 pounds, more than entire fighter aircraft in the previous war. The radial engine produced over 2,000 horsepower when the turbo supercharger system engaged, enough power to push the enormous fighter to speeds exceeding 400 to 30 miles per hour at altitude. But it was the armament that represented the true revolution in fighter design. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing panel, each weapon capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. The combined firepower delivered over 5,000 rounds per minute when all guns fired simultaneously. Each 50 caliber projectile weighed nearly 4 ounces and carried sufficient kinetic energy to punch through armor plate, shred aircraft structures, and destroy engines with devastating efficiency. If you're enjoying this deep, dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Luftwaffe intelligence officers studying reconnaissance photographs of American airfields dismissed the P-47 as a tactical curiosity rather than a serious threat. The aircraft's size violated every principle of fighter design that had emerged from 2 decades of aerial combat evolution. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 prioritized lightweight and maneuverability, creating aircraft that could turn inside any opponent and maintain energy in prolonged dogfights. The P-47 appeared to be exactly the opposite. Heavy, ungainly, and seemingly unsuited for the close-quarters combat that defined fighter warfare over Europe. Major Günther Roll, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 confirmed victories on the Eastern Front, reviewed intelligence summaries with barely concealed skepticism. The Americans had built a fighter that weighed more than most light bombers, mounting an engine that consumed fuel at prodigious rates, while offering questionable advantages in combat scenarios that favored lighter, more agile aircraft. The 8 machine guns represented impressive firepower on paper, but European combat experience suggested that concentrated cannon fire from a single weapon proved more effective than scattered machine gun impacts. A single 20mm cannon shell could destroy critical aircraft systems or kill a pilot instantly, while machine gun bullets often passed through aircraft structures without causing catastrophic damage. The German assessment reflected decades of aerial combat doctrine that emphasized pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability over brute force and mechanical complexity. Lieutenant Colonel Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, understood that his pilots would have to develop entirely new tactical approaches to maximize the Thunderbolt's unusual characteristics. The aircraft could not turn with German fighters in traditional dogfights. Its weight and wing loading made sustained horizontal maneuvering a guaranteed path to defeat against lighter opponents. But the massive engine and turbo supercharger system gave the Thunderbolt capabilities that no German fighter could match at high altitude. Zemke's tactical revolution emerged through systematic analysis of the P-47's actual performance envelope rather than theoretical assumptions about fighter combat. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than any aircraft in the sky, reaching speeds that approached the sound barrier, where control surfaces began to lose effectiveness. More critically, it could climb back to altitude after high-speed dives, using its tremendous power-to-weight ratio at high altitude to regain energy that would be lost forever in lighter fighters. The key insight was simple but profound. The Thunderbolt should never fight like a European fighter. Instead, it should use speed and altitude advantage to make slashing attacks, diving through enemy formations with guns blazing, then climbing back to safety before German fighters could respond. The 850 caliber machine guns made this hit-and-run tactic devastatingly effective, creating a cone of fire so dense that precise aiming became almost unnecessary. Training exercises at bases across England in early 1944 revealed the Thunderbolt's true potential, when pilots stopped trying to dogfight and instead embraced boom and zoom tactics that exploited American advantages. Captain Walker Mahurin demonstrated the technique during a practice mission against Supermarine Spitfires, flown by RAF pilots. The British fighters could turn circles around the massive Thunderbolt at any altitude, seemingly dominating the engagement through superior maneuverability. But Mahurin refused to engage in turning fights, instead maintaining altitude advantage and making repeated diving attacks that the Spitfires could not counter. Each dive brought him through the British formation at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, too fast for the Spitfires to track or engage effectively. After each pass, Mahurin climbed back to altitude using the Thunderbolt's superior power, resetting the tactical situation for another attack. The RAF pilots, experienced combat veterans themselves, acknowledged that this new American tactic represented something genuinely revolutionary in fighter operations. By March 1944, Thunderbolt groups had refined these tactics through combat experience over occupied France and Germany. The results challenged every assumption about fighter effectiveness that Luftwaffe commanders held. American fighters that should have been easy victims were instead destroying German interceptors at rates that German tactical doctrine could not explain. More troubling, the Thunderbolt seemed to absorb battle damage that would have destroyed any German fighter, returning to base with dozens of cannon shell holes while maintaining flight stability and engine power. Republic Aviation had built structural strength into the P-47 that reflected American engineering philosophy. The airframe could withstand 12 times the force of gravity in high-speed maneuvers, far exceeding the structural limits of lighter European designs. The massive radial engine, air-cooled rather than dependent on vulnerable liquid coolant systems, could continue operating even after sustaining damage that would have left a Messerschmitt's inline engine frozen and useless. Most significantly, the redundant systems and sheer size of the aircraft meant that battle damage often affected non-critical areas, leaving the Thunderbolt capable of controlled flight even with severe structural damage. German pilots began reporting encounters with American fighters that seemed almost indestructible. Major Heinz Baer, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 1, personally witnessed a Thunderbolt absorb multiple cannon hits during an engagement over Hanover in February 1944. His 20mm shells struck the American fighter's wing root and fuselage, impacts that should have caused catastrophic structural failure or at minimum forced an immediate emergency landing. Instead, the Thunderbolt continued flying straight and level, its pilot apparently unaffected by damage that would have killed any German fighter pilot instantly. Baer watched in disbelief as the American aircraft maintained formation with its squadron, eventually disappearing into cloud cover while trailing only minimal smoke. Post-mission debriefing proved difficult for German pilots trying to explain combat results that contradicted their training and experience. Intelligence officers questioned reports about American fighters that wouldn't fall from the sky, despite receiving what appeared to be killing blows. The standard explanation that American pilots were simply lucky, or that German marksmanship had somehow degraded, satisfied no one who had actually faced the Thunderbolts in combat. The reality was simpler but more troubling for German tactical planning. American engineers had approached fighter design from a completely different philosophical foundation than their European counterparts. Where German designers sought to create the most efficient killing machines possible within tight resource constraints, Americans had built fighters that reflected industrial abundance and different tactical priorities. Weight didn't matter when you had engines powerful enough to overcome it. Complexity was acceptable when you had manufacturing capacity to produce standardized components by the millions. And overwhelming firepower made tactical sense when ammunition weight was less critical than the certainty of destroying any target that entered your gun sight. The strategic implications were becoming clear to thoughtful German commanders by spring 1944. The Luftwaffe faced American fighters that operated according to different tactical rules, exploiting advantages that German doctrine had never anticipated and couldn't effectively counter with existing aircraft or tactics. April 9, 1945, began with intelligence reports indicating massive American fighter activity across southern Germany. Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin tracked over 400 P-47 Thunderbolts, launching from bases in France and Belgium, their flight paths indicating coordinated attacks against German transportation networks and airfields. The scale of the operation exceeded anything American fighters had previously attempted, suggesting either desperation or confidence that German defenses had degraded beyond effective resistance. General Major Adolf Galland, recently relieved of his command position after months of disagreements with Hermann Göring over Luftwaffe tactical doctrine, monitored the situation from his quarters near Munich. The former general of the fighter arm understood better than most that the air war over Germany was lost, that American numerical superiority had become so overwhelming that tactical skill and aircraft quality no longer mattered in determining outcomes. But he retained enough professional pride to hope that German pilots might achieve one final defensive victory against the seemingly endless streams of American aircraft that now dominated German skies. The morning weather favored the attackers. Clear skies with unlimited visibility allowed American fighter groups to coordinate their attacks with precision that had been impossible during the overcast winter months. Thunderbolt formations approached their targets at medium altitude, 12 to 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid most light anti-aircraft fire, but low enough to maintain target visibility for the devastating strafing attacks that had become their specialty. First Lieutenant Quince Brown, flying with the 78th Fighter Group, spotted his initial target shortly after 0900 hours. Munich Riem Airfield sprawled below, its runways and taxiways lined with German aircraft in various states of readiness. Intelligence estimates suggested over 80 fighters and bombers were stationed at the field, representing a significant concentration of remaining Luftwaffe strength in southern Germany. Brown's formation leader, Major Arval Robeson, initiated the attack with textbook precision. The Thunderbolts rolled into steep dives from 12,000 feet, accelerating rapidly to over 400 miles per hour as they descended toward the German airfield. Anti-aircraft positions opened fire immediately, filling the sky with explosive shells that created black puffs of smoke throughout the diving American formation. But the Thunderbolt's speed and the shallow angle of their attack made accurate tracking nearly impossible for German gunners trained on horizontal bombing attacks rather than high-speed strafing runs. Brown selected a line of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters parked near the main hangar complex, their distinctive shapes unmistakable even at high speed. At 500 yards range, he pressed his gun trigger and felt the familiar vibration as 850 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The convergence point, carefully calibrated by his ground crew, placed all 8 streams of bullets into a concentrated impact area, roughly 6 feet in diameter, at typical strafing ranges. The effect on stationary ground targets was devastating. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds designed to penetrate aircraft structures from any angle tore through the parked Messerschmitts with catastrophic results. Fuel tanks exploded in brilliant orange fireballs as tracer rounds ignited gasoline vapors. Engine blocks shattered under the kinetic impact of multiple 50 caliber hits, rendering aircraft immediately beyond economical repair, even if they survived the fires that quickly spread through the parking area. Brown's initial pass destroyed 4 fighters in approximately 3 seconds of firing time, his ammunition expenditure totaling perhaps 200 rounds from his total load of 2,500. The efficiency was almost unimaginable compared to traditional bombing attacks that required multiple aircraft dropping tons of explosives to achieve similar destruction levels. He pulled up sharply at 500 feet, the Thunderbolt's massive engine pulling him back to altitude with authority that would have been impossible in a lighter fighter carrying similar fuel and ammunition loads. The 78th Fighter Group's attack on Munich Riem lasted 12 minutes from initial dive to final departure. During that brief period, American pilots systematically destroyed 67 German aircraft on the ground, damaged another 23 beyond immediate repair capability, and eliminated critical ground support facilities, including fuel dumps and ammunition storage bunkers. The cost was 2 Thunderbolts lost to anti-aircraft fire, both pilots surviving to become prisoners of war, and 5 aircraft damaged but capable of returning to base. Similar attacks unfolded simultaneously across dozens of German airfields throughout Bavaria and Austria. The 56th Fighter Group hit Neuburg Airfield and claimed 41 aircraft destroyed. The 352nd Fighter Group attacked Straubing and reported 38 kills. The Thunderbolt groups had developed airfield attack into a precise tactical operation, maximizing destruction while minimizing exposure to German defensive fire through coordinated timing and aggressive execution. German fighter response proved entirely inadequate to counter the coordinated American offensive. Luftwaffe pilots attempting to intercept the attacking Thunderbolts found themselves outnumbered and outmatched by American fighters that controlled altitude and energy advantage from the moment they entered German airspace. Those German fighters that managed to take off during the attacks faced an even worse tactical situation, caught at low altitude with minimal airspeed, while American fighters dove on them from above with devastating effect. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler experienced this nightmare scenario firsthand when his Messerschmitt Bf-109 lifted off from Neuburg just as the 56th Fighter Group began their strafing runs. Stigler had approximately 15 seconds of flight time before 4 Thunderbolts dove on his position from 8,000 feet above. He saw them coming, recognized the tactical impossibility of his situation, and still attempted to evade through a hard left turn that bled critical airspeed from his already slow-moving fighter. The lead Thunderbolt pilot, Captain Clayton Kelly Gross, opened fire at 400 yards range, well beyond the effective distance for German fighter armament, but perfectly reasonable for 850 caliber machine guns, creating a dense pattern of fire. Stigler felt impacts, hammering his aircraft's airframe, heard the distinctive crack of bullets punching through aluminum skin and striking internal structures. His engine began trailing white smoke as coolant sprayed from ruptured lines, signaling imminent engine failure that would leave him helpless in enemy-controlled airspace. He had perhaps 30 seconds before complete engine seizure. Stigler chopped his throttle and deployed his landing gear. the universal signal of surrender that he hoped would prevent the American pilot from finishing the kill. Gross recognized the signal and broke off his attack, circling overhead as Stigler's crippled Messerschmitt descended toward an emergency landing in a farm field adjacent to the airfield perimeter. The German pilot survived, but his aircraft joined the rapidly growing total of Luftwaffe fighters, destroyed on April 9th. By mid-afternoon, preliminary reports reaching Luftwaffe headquarters painted a picture of catastrophe that exceeded the worst-case planning scenarios German commanders had developed. Over 200 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. Multiple major airfields rendered temporarily inoperative due to runway damage and destroyed support facilities. Pilot casualties included some of Germany's most experienced fighter leaders, killed during futile attempts to defend their airfields against overwhelming American attacks. The statistical reality was even more devastating than the absolute numbers suggested. Germany's aircraft production, despite propaganda claims about wonder weapons and industrial miracles, could not replace losses at the rate American fighters were now destroying aircraft on the ground. The Luftwaffe had effectively lost the equivalent of 20 fighter groups in a single day of operations, a loss rate that would have been unsustainable even at the height of German industrial capacity in 1943. General Major Galland, reviewing preliminary loss reports that evening, understood that April 9th represented more than a tactical defeat. It marked the final proof that the Luftwaffe could no longer contest American air superiority over Germany itself. The Reich's fighter force, once capable of inflicting prohibitive losses on Allied bomber formations, had been reduced to scattered defensive units, unable to protect German airspace, ground facilities, or remaining aircraft from systematic American destruction. The irony was complete. German pilots who had laughed at the ungainly Thunderbolt in 1943 now faced a tactical situation where those same aircraft operated with virtual impunity over German territory. The flying milk bottle had evolved into the most effective ground attack fighter in the European theatre, destroying targets that no other aircraft could engage so efficiently, while absorbing battle damage that would have eliminated any German fighter from combat operations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The aftermath of April 9th forced fundamental reassessment of tactical assumptions that had guided Luftwaffe operations since the war's beginning. German fighter doctrine, developed through successful campaigns against Poland, France, and initially the Soviet Union, emphasized pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability as the decisive factors in aerial combat. The assumption was that well-trained German pilots flying superior aircraft would naturally dominate any engagement, regardless of numerical disadvantages or tactical circumstances. The Thunderbolt's success challenged every aspect of this doctrine. American pilots with far less training than their German counterparts were achieving tactical superiority through aircraft capabilities and tactical approaches that German doctrine had never anticipated. The massive radial engine and turbo supercharger system gave American fighters performance advantages at high altitude that made traditional energy fighting tactics ineffective. The 850 caliber machine guns created firepower density that eliminated the need for precise marksmanship that took years to develop in German pilots. Most fundamentally, American industrial capacity allowed the deployment of overwhelming numbers that rendered individual pilot skill increasingly irrelevant to operational outcomes. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter leaders with over 170 confirmed victories, attempted to explain the tactical transformation in his post-mission report on April 10th. The document, marked secret and distributed only to senior Luftwaffe commanders, acknowledged that German fighter tactics developed for combat against similar European opponents simply did not apply to American operations. The Thunderbolt, Steinhoff wrote, fights according to different rules that we cannot counter with existing aircraft or tactics. Its pilots refuse to engage in traditional dogfighting, where our advantages in maneuverability might prove decisive. Instead, they attack from altitude with overwhelming speed and firepower, then disengage before we can respond effectively. The structural strength of their aircraft allows them to dive at speeds we cannot match without risking catastrophic structural failure. Their heavy armament destroys our fighters with brief firing bursts that require minimal accuracy. Most critically, their numerical superiority means that even successful defensive engagements merely delay inevitable defeat rather than achieving meaningful tactical victories. Steinhoff's assessment included specific tactical recommendations that acknowledged the Luftwaffe's deteriorating position. German fighters should avoid engaging Thunderbolts at high altitude where American performance advantages proved decisive. Interceptors should focus on attacking bombers rather than their escorts, accepting higher casualties in exchange for destroying strategic targets. Most controversially, Steinhoff suggested that preserving experienced pilots had become more important than defending specific targets, since pilot losses could not be replaced while aircraft production continued at reduced but sustainable levels. The recommendations were filed and effectively ignored by Luftwaffe High Command, which continued to demand aggressive defense of German territory despite mounting evidence that such operations were producing catastrophic losses without meaningful tactical success. The April 9th disaster had revealed fundamental weaknesses in German air power that no amount of tactical innovation could overcome, given existing resource constraints and strategic circumstances. The technological evolution of the P-47 Thunderbolt throughout 1944 and 45 represented American industrial capacity operating at peak efficiency. Republic Aviation continuously refined the design based on combat feedback from operational units, creating variants that addressed specific tactical requirements while maintaining the fundamental characteristics that made the Thunderbolt effective. The P-47D model, introduced in spring 1944, incorporated a bubble canopy that provided 360-degree visibility, eliminating blind spots that had allowed German fighters to approach undetected during earlier engagements. The new canopy design added minimal weight while dramatically improving pilot situational awareness, a critical factor in combat scenarios where detecting threats early meant the difference between survival and death. More significantly, Republic engineers developed external fuel tank systems that extended the Thunderbolt's already impressive range to over 1,800 miles with drop tanks. This modification transformed the fighter from a medium-range escort into a strategic weapon capable of accompanying bombers to any target in German-controlled Europe and returning with fuel reserves for extended combat operations. The extended-range Thunderbolts eliminated the safe zones where German fighters could intercept Allied bombers without facing American escort fighters. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, the European theater's leading P-47 ace with 28 confirmed victories, experienced the evolved Thunderbolt's capabilities during an escort mission to Berlin on May 8, 1944. His 56th Fighter Group departed their English base at 0700 hours, climbed to 28,000 feet over the North Sea, and maintained that altitude throughout the 800-mile flight to the German capital. The external fuel tanks carried enough gasoline to reach Berlin with 2 hours of combat endurance remaining, enough for sustained engagement with German interceptors while maintaining protective coverage over the bomber formation. The mission profile would have been impossible just 6 months earlier, when fuel constraints forced American escorts to turn back before reaching heavily defended German industrial targets. Gabreski's formation encountered concentrated Luftwaffe resistance approximately 50 miles west of Berlin, as German fighters rose to intercept the incoming bomber stream. The engagement demonstrated how technological improvements combined with tactical experience to create devastating effectiveness against German defensive efforts. Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters climbing toward the American formation found themselves at serious disadvantage against Thunderbolts that had maintained high altitude throughout their approach flight. German fighters, after climbing to interception altitude from ground alert status, arrived with minimal, excess speed and reduced fuel reserves, tactical disadvantages that American pilots exploited ruthlessly. Gabreski led his flight in a diving attack that built airspeed to over 450 miles per hour before engaging the climbing German fighters. The speed differential, combined with altitude advantage and overwhelming firepower from 850 caliber machine guns, created tactical situations that German pilots could not counter effectively. His opening burst struck the lead Messerschmitt's engine, cowling, the concentrated fire literally tearing the DB-605 engine from its mounts and sending it tumbling toward Earth, separately from the now uncontrollable airframe. The pilot, Hauptmann Wilhelm Steinmann, had approximately 2 seconds between engine loss and the need to bail out, insufficient time to understand what had just destroyed his aircraft with such catastrophic violence. The engagement lasted 17 minutes and resulted in 14 confirmed German fighters destroyed against no American losses. More critically, the bomber formation reached its target without interference, delivered its bomb load with precision that destroyed significant portions of Berlin's remaining ball-bearing production capacity, and returned to England with only 3 aircraft lost to anti-aircraft fire. The mission demonstrated that American fighters had achieved air superiority over Germany itself, that the Luftwaffe could no longer contest control of German airspace against determined Allied operations. The psychological impact on surviving German pilots proved as significant as the physical destruction of their aircraft and comrades. Major Günther Roll, recovering from injuries sustained during a previous engagement with American fighters, interviewed survivors from the Berlin battle and found consistent patterns of demoralization that transcended normal combat stress. Experienced pilots described feeling helpless against American tactics and equipment, unable to employ the skills they had developed over years of combat operations because the tactical situations never allowed traditional dogfighting techniques. The Americans, they reported, never fought fairly, never engaged in the turning combats where German advantages in aircraft maneuverability and pilot training might prove decisive. Instead, the Thunderbolts attacked with overwhelming speed and firepower, then disengaged before German fighters could respond, only to return minutes later for another devastating pass. Roll's report to Luftwaffe headquarters attempted to explain that the air war had evolved beyond traditional fighter tactics, that American technological and numerical advantages had created tactical conditions where individual pilot skill mattered far less than systemic factors like aircraft performance, ammunition capacity, and operational logistics. The assessment was technically accurate, but strategically irrelevant, since Germany lacked the industrial capacity or remaining time to develop effective countermeasures to American air superiority. By June 1944, Thunderbolt groups had refined ground attack techniques to such precision that individual aircraft regularly destroyed multiple locomotives, vehicles, or parked aircraft during single combat sorties. The evolution from high-altitude escort fighter to devastating ground attack platform represented tactical flexibility that German commanders had not anticipated when dismissing the Thunderbolt as an ungainly curiosity in 1943. Captain Robert Johnson, who had survived being shot down over France in June 1944 and evaded capture with French resistance assistance, returned to operations in September with enhanced appreciation for the Thunderbolt's ground attack capabilities. During his evasion, French civilians had shared stories about American fighter attacks on German transportation networks, describing the psychological terror German troops experienced when Thunderbolts appeared over roads and rail lines with their distinctive engine note that gave seconds of warning before 50 caliber machine guns began their destructive work. Johnson's first mission after returning from evasion involved attacking a German armoured column moving toward American positions during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major counterattack in the West, depended on rapid armoured advances through narrow forest roads, where German columns presented concentrated targets that American air power could destroy if weather permitted flight operations. The initial week of the offensive occurred during overcast conditions that grounded Allied aircraft, allowing German forces to achieve tactical surprise and significant territorial gains against thinly defended American positions. But on December 23rd, the weather cleared with dramatic suddenness, revealing the full extent of German commitment to the offensive. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of vehicles, and the last operational reserves of German armour stretched across narrow approach roads in eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. The target environment represented everything ground attack aircraft had been designed to destroy. Enemy forces concentrated in the open with limited concealment and restricted manoeuvre space. Johnson led his flight of 4 Thunderbolts toward the Bastogne area, where German armoured columns were attempting to encircle American paratroopers defending the critical road junction. Intelligence reports indicated heavy German traffic on the N4 highway between Arlon and Bastogne, a main supply route that German commanders needed to sustain their advance toward the Meuse River and Antwerp beyond. The Thunderbolts approached at 10,000 feet, high enough to survey the tactical situation while remaining above effective anti-aircraft range. Johnson spotted the target immediately. A German column stretching over 3 miles along the narrow highway, vehicles packed nose to tail in violation of every tactical doctrine about maintaining dispersion against air attack. Desperation had forced German commanders to accept risks that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war, when Luftwaffe fighter cover provided at least minimal protection against Allied aircraft. Now, with the Luftwaffe effectively eliminated from the battlefield, German ground forces moved in the open and accepted whatever casualties American air attacks inflicted. The attack began with Johnson's flight rolling into shallow dives from 10,000 feet, building speed to over 400 miles per hour as they descended toward the highway. German anti-aircraft positions opened fire immediately, creating streams of tracer fire that arced toward the diving American fighters with minimal accuracy. The Thunderbolt's speed and armoured construction made them nearly invulnerable to light, anti-aircraft weapons, while their pilots' experience allowed them to identify and avoid the heavier anti-aircraft concentrations that posed genuine threats. Johnson opened fire at 800 yards range, his 8 machine guns creating a stream of destruction that walked along the packed German column with devastating effect. Trucks exploded as fuel tanks ruptured and gasoline ignited. Half-tracks burned after armour-piercing rounds penetrated their thin armour and destroyed engines or ammunition storage. Personnel carriers disintegrated under concentrated .50 caliber fire that killed exposed troops and rendered vehicles immediately beyond salvage. His initial pass destroyed or disabled 17 vehicles in approximately 4 seconds of firing time. The 3 following Thunderbolts repeated the attack pattern, each pilot selecting different sections of the column to maximize destruction and minimize redundant targeting. Within 90 seconds, the German column had ceased to exist as a functional military formation. Over 70 vehicles burned or lay disabled across 3 miles of highway, creating roadblocks that prevented movement of following units and trapped the entire advance along that approach route. The tactical effect extended far beyond the physical destruction of equipment and personnel. German commanders, attempting to coordinate the offensive, found their communications networks jammed with reports about air attacks, destroying supply columns, preventing reinforcement of forward units, and creating logistical chaos that paralyzed offensive operations. The carefully planned timetables that depended on rapid armored advances collapsed as American fighters systematically destroyed the transportation networks that German forces needed to sustain their attack momentum. Throughout the Ardennes battlefield, similar scenes played out as hundreds of Thunderbolts attacked German columns caught in the open. The 9th Air Force alone flew over 11,000 fighter bomber sorties between December 23rd and December 26th, destroying thousands of German vehicles and inflicting casualties that transformed Hitler's last offensive from a strategic threat into a catastrophic defeat that consumed Germany's final mobile reserves. The effectiveness of these ground attacks exceeded even optimistic Allied predictions. Intelligence analysts estimating German losses during the Bulge campaign calculated that American air attacks destroyed more German armor than ground combat engagements, a remarkable achievement that demonstrated how completely air power had come to dominate the modern battlefield. Thunderbolt pilots returning from these missions reported target-rich environments, where finding something to attack proved easier than deciding which targets deserved priority. The transformation from the defensive battles of 1943, when German fighters had savaged American bomber formations with relative impunity, to the one-sided destruction of late 1944, represented a fundamental shift in the European air war's tactical balance. Major Heinz Baer, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter leaders with over 200 confirmed victories, attempted to explain the transformation in tactical reports that acknowledged German air power's effective elimination as a factor in military operations. The Americans, Baer wrote, have achieved absolute air superiority through overwhelming numbers combined with tactical approaches we cannot counter. Their Thunderbolts operate with impunity over German territory, destroying targets at will while accepting minimal losses to our defensive efforts. Our fighter force lacks the fuel, pilots, and aircraft necessary to contest American operations, even when we identify critical targets requiring defense. Most significantly, American pilots have developed tactical competence that matches or exceeds our own, despite having far less individual combat experience. Their standardized training and tactical doctrine creates consistent performance across entire fighter groups, while our remaining pilots vary wildly in capability between a few surviving aces and inadequately trained replacements who die during their first combat missions. Baer's assessment included recommendations that acknowledged reality rather than pursuing futile resistance against overwhelming odds. German fighter forces should be preserved for defense of critical industrial targets rather than wasted in futile attempts to achieve tactical victories against numerically superior American formations. Pilot training should emphasize survival over offensive operations, since experienced pilots represented irreplaceable assets, while aircraft could still be manufactured in limited quantities. Most controversially, Baer suggested that Germany should seek negotiated peace terms before the complete destruction of remaining military forces eliminated any bargaining position in surrender negotiations. The recommendations were ignored by Nazi leadership committed to fighting until total defeat, but they represented honest tactical assessment from officers who understood that the air war was lost beyond any hope of reversal. The final months of the European war saw Thunderbolt groups operating with virtually complete freedom over German territory. The Luftwaffe, reduced to scattered defensive units with inadequate fuel and minimal pilot training, could no longer contest American air operations in any meaningful way. German civilians described the psychological impact of constant air attacks, the sound of American radial engines that signaled incoming destruction against which no effective defense existed. The Thunderbolt's distinctive engine note, once mocked as the sound of an ungainly truck with wings, had become a soundtrack of Germany's defeat. By April 1945, Republic aviation had delivered over 15,000 Thunderbolts to American and Allied air forces, making it the most numerous American fighter aircraft of the war. These fighters had flown over 546,000 combat sorties in the European theatre alone, destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, and delivered more ordnance on ground targets than many medium bomber types. The combat record represented vindication of Alexander Kartvel's radical design philosophy, proving that American engineering approaches, emphasizing overwhelming power and firepower, could create tactical effectiveness that matched or exceeded European designs optimized for different combat parameters. Lieutenant Colonel Hub Zemke, who had pioneered Thunderbolt tactics in 1943, and survived being shot down over Germany in October 1944, returned from prisoner of war status in May 1945 with enhanced perspective on the aircraft's historical significance. The Thunderbolt, Zemke argued in post-war assessments, represented a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy from European emphasis on lightweight agility to American focus on survival, firepower, and versatility. The aircraft's ability to absorb tremendous battle damage while maintaining flight capability had saved hundreds of American pilots who would have died in lighter, more fragile fighters. The 850 caliber machine guns had provided firepower sufficient for any tactical requirement, from destroying enemy fighters to devastating ground targets that previous generation fighters could barely damage. Most significantly, the Thunderbolt's evolution from high-altitude escort to deadly ground attack platform demonstrated design flexibility that allowed adaptation to changing tactical requirements without fundamental airframe modifications. Post-war analysis revealed details about April 9, 1945, that confirmed its significance as the single most destructive day for Luftwaffe aircraft losses during the entire war. Final Tallies indicated 211 German aircraft destroyed on the ground, an additional 43 destroyed in air combat, and over 150 damaged beyond immediate repair capability. The losses represented approximately 20% of Germany's remaining operational aircraft inventory, destroyed in a single day of coordinated American fighter operations. The tactical achievement proved possible only because of the Thunderbolt's unique combination of characteristics: long range allowing deep penetration missions, heavy armament providing devastating attack capability, and structural strength permitting sustained low-altitude operations in defended airspace. Luftwaffe survivors interviewed after the war consistently identified the Thunderbolt as among the most feared Allied aircraft, respected for its firepower, durability, and the tactical competence of its pilots. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who survived the war and later became a senior West German Air Force officer, acknowledged that German dismissal of the Thunderbolt as a clumsy, ungainly fighter represented one of the Luftwaffe's most significant tactical miscalculations. "We assumed," Steinhoff recalled in post-war interviews, that fighter combat would always favor light, maneuverable aircraft flown by highly trained pilots. The Americans demonstrated that overwhelming firepower, structural durability, and tactical doctrine suited to aircraft characteristics could achieve air superiority even when individual aircraft seemed inferior by traditional measures. The Thunderbolt forced us to fight according to American rules, and we discovered too late that we had no effective counter to their approach. The legacy of April 9, 1945, extended beyond tactical statistics to represent the culmination of American air power development during World War II. The massive investment in pilot training, aircraft production, and tactical doctrine refinement had created air forces capable of achieving absolute superiority over Axis opponents through systematic application of industrial capacity and technological innovation. The Thunderbolt embodied this approach, representing American willingness to build bigger, heavier, and more powerful than traditional fighter design philosophy suggested appropriate. German pilots who had laughed at the flying milk bottle in 1943 had stopped laughing by 1945. The ungainly fighter they had dismissed as easy prey had instead become the instrument of their defeat, destroying aircraft on the ground, dominating air combat through overwhelming firepower, and demonstrating that American engineering philosophy could create tactical effectiveness that European traditions could neither match nor counter. The .850 caliber machine guns that seemed excessive in theory had proven devastatingly practical in combat, creating destruction that no amount of pilot skill or aircraft agility could overcome. Franz Stigler, the German pilot who survived being shot down on April 9th, spent his remaining weeks of the war in American custody, treated with professional courtesy by captors who seemed genuinely uninterested in triumphalism or revenge. His interrogators asked detailed questions about German tactics, aircraft performance, and pilot training, collecting information that would inform post-war military aviation development. Stigler answered honestly, acknowledging that the Luftwaffe had been defeated not through any single factor, but through the cumulative weight of American industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and the particular characteristics of aircraft like the Thunderbolt that embodied American approaches to military problems. Years later, meeting with American Thunderbolt pilots at reunion events, Stigler acknowledged the grudging respect German pilots had developed for the aircraft they had initially mocked. The P-47 was never elegant, he noted, never beautiful in the way a Messerschmitt or Spitfire appeared beautiful. But it was supremely effective at everything it did, and effectiveness matters far more than elegance when your nation's survival depends on winning the air war. We learned that lesson too late to matter for Germany, but the Americans understood it from the beginning. The statistical summary of Thunderbolt operations in the European theatre told the story with numerical precision. 15,683 aircraft delivered to operational units, 546,000 combat sorties flown, 7,000 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, 86,000 tons of ordnance delivered on ground targets, 3,752 aircraft lost to all causes, a loss rate of 0.7% per sortie that reflected the aircraft's durability and the tactical competence of its pilots. These numbers represented more than abstract statistics. They documented the systematic destruction of German air power, the elimination of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force, and the achievement of absolute Allied air superiority that made Germany's final defeat inevitable. The Thunderbolt had been the primary instrument of that achievement, flying more sorties and destroying more enemy aircraft than any other American fighter type in the European theatre. The ungainly fighter that German pilots had mocked as a flying milk bottle had written itself into military aviation history through sheer combat effectiveness. Its pilots had developed tactics that exploited American technological advantages while minimizing inherent disadvantages, creating combat approaches that German doctrine could not counter. And on April 9, 1945, Thunderbolt groups had demonstrated the aircraft's full potential through the systematic destruction of German air power in a single day of coordinated operations that represented American military aviation at its most effective. The lesson was clear even to those who had initially dismissed American fighter design philosophy. Air superiority in modern warfare belonged to those nations capable of building, deploying, and employing aircraft in sufficient numbers to overwhelm opposition through systematic application of industrial capacity and tactical innovation. The Thunderbolt embodied that reality, proving that bigger, heavier, and more powerful could defeat lighter, more agile opponents when backed by adequate training, sound tactics, and overwhelming numbers. German pilots had learned that lesson through bitter experience, watching their air force systematically destroyed by fighters they had once considered laughable jokes. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.